Hi, welcome back to the AnCap Entrepreneur Network, where we're building businesses for a free society. I've got Peter G. Klein on the Skype with me on a video Skype session. Peter is Senior Scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. He has some other credits to his title, but that's the one that impresses me the most. Peter is his area of study is entrepreneurship and business management in general. He's done a lot of work, a lot of research and presentations, and I believe also teaches on entrepreneurship within an Austrian economics tradition. So I was very pleased that Peter agreed to come on the line and discuss with us entrepreneurship and how we can use that to bring more liberty into our lives.
Hi, Mark. How are you this morning?
Hey, Peter. How's it going?
It's going great. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay. You're looking good, and I think we're going out. It'll be about 5 seconds, and I'll see it on the big screen, and I'll be able to tell what everybody else is doing. So, one thing I realized just before we get started with the questions, with your introduction, how much of your work is the work I'm familiar with, your research into entrepreneurship and sort of the fundamental ideas of Austrian economics, and how much of your work is teaching MBA programs, perhaps more traditional entrepreneurship things?
But that's a good question. I mean, my main teaching appointment at the University of Missouri is in teaching courses in management, managerial economics, business strategy, and entrepreneurship. And it depends on the level of the course. In our introductory courses, we're teaching some very basic skills, some basic business skills, new venture planning, and so on, some marketing skills. In the more advanced classes, where we're discussing more the kind of conceptual foundations of entrepreneurship, the impact of entrepreneurship in society, and so on, then we get more into some of the issues that we'll be discussing today, specifically the role of the entrepreneur in the Austrian conception of the market. But, you know, I have a somewhat broad teaching portfolio, so at the undergraduate, MBA, and even at the doctoral level, the extent to which we get into these deeper issues really depends on the context of the course.
Interesting.
But I mean,
one of the things I'm interested in following up is just what the differences are between sort of the traditional ways that entrepreneurship is discussed in business schools and what new insights Austrian economics brings to it.
Absolutely, and we can certainly get into that during the discussion today. I'd be happy to talk about that.
Okay, well, give us a quick background of your research, your recent book, the sort of things you've written about, and one of the things I'd like to do during the course of this interview is get to a good, solid definition of what an entrepreneur is, according to the Austrian School of Economics. So give us a start on that path, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, I've been interested in the economics of entrepreneurship for, 20 years or so, since I did my own graduate work. I've been involved in the Austrian movement since my graduate school days, was a fellow of the Mises Institute back in the late 80s and early 90s, got the opportunity to work with Murray Rothbard. I served as his assistant with the Journal of Libertarian Studies, and had the opportunity to sort of learn at the feet of some of the great Austrian economists. At the same time, my formal graduate training at the University of California was in a more mainstream area of applied economics, business economics, and organizational economics. I studied with Berkeley professor Oliver Williamson, who was one of the 2 Nobel laureates in economics in 2009. And he's famous for developing a particular approach to understanding business organizations and how entrepreneurs, though he doesn't use the language of entrepreneurship, but how entrepreneurs come up with sort of creative organizational solutions to important business problems. He famously studied vertical integration and corporate diversification issues of firm scope, organizational design, from an economic efficiency perspective. So I did my formal training under him, and then I've taught in a few different business schools, economics departments, applied econ departments, at sort of more or less mainstream universities, teaching business economics, managerial economics, and more recently entrepreneurship. Have had the opportunity to work with some very good graduate students, particularly in the last few years, who are working explicitly on Austrian topics. And at the University of Missouri, we have a small Austrian study group. We did an Austrian PhD seminar in the fall. We have a human action reading group going on now. So we have quite a cluster of young people who are interested in not only sort of conventional approaches to entrepreneurship and strategic management and organizational design, but also the Austrian tradition, broader issues associated with the free market, and so on. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying almost all of my career has been about blending or incorporating insights from the Austrians, in particular Mises and Rothbard, with insights from modern organizational economics and entrepreneurship studies, people like Williamson, Ronald Coase, and other more mainstream figures who have worked to develop kind of a theory of business strategy, business design, business organization, management structure, and so on.
Well, nice. I avoided the whole field of economics, at least macroeconomics, until I learned about the Austrians. So I'm somewhat ignorant of the mainstream's ideas of economy, perhaps blissfully so. But
yeah, I tend to macroeconomics as well to the extent that I can, but it's been more difficult in the last few years. But you asked about entrepreneurship and
yes,
sort of how I view the entrepreneur and how the mainstream business school literature and economics literature and policymakers, how they view the entrepreneur, and I can comment a little bit on that.
Yes,
as well.
That. Because in the mainstream, the word entrepreneur gets sort of touted around as a cure-all for whatever ills there are, and people use the word in different ways. So tell us about the mainstream view and how the Austrian view is more specific.
Right. Well, it's a great question. There's a lot more discussion of entrepreneurship within the mainstream, among academics, among policymakers, people at think tanks, the World Bank. Everybody thinks that entrepreneurship is important, that we ought to have more of it, that it's somehow associated with economic growth and prosperity. But I think the mainstream literature is really all over the map in trying to conceive what entrepreneurship is and why it might matter. Let me say a word or two about kind of mainstream economics first, and then a word or two about mainstream management theory, or what gets taught in business schools and MBA programs. Entrepreneurship was an important part of economic theory from its origins in the 18th century through the middle of the 20th century. Not only the Austrians, Karl Menger and his associates, but many other important economists from different schools of thought all theorized about the role of the entrepreneur in society, the importance of entrepreneurship, the function performed by the entrepreneur, and so on. But then the entrepreneur pretty much disappeared from mainstream economics by the 1950s, 1960s, as neoclassical economics became more mathematical and more focused on sort of static equilibrium analysis, developing models in which there is no room for the entrepreneur, no need for an entrepreneur, no role for the entrepreneur to play. So mainstream economists had, and continue to this day, to have a little bit of sort of cognitive dissonance. They sort of they think that entrepreneurship must be something important because they hear about it in everyday discourse, and business people talk about it, and the media talks about it, and so on. But they really don't know how to handle it because they can't model it mathematically. They cannot insert it into some kind of a formal, physics-style model of the economy for fine-tuning and so on. So they mostly, it's sort of like, the elephant in the room. They polite. You avoid talking about it in polite company among mainstream economists. Now, in business schools, students are interested in it. Deans are interested in it. Donors are interested in it. Employers are interested in it. So every business school nowadays has an entrepreneurship program and entrepreneurship courses and maybe an entrepreneurship center, an entrepreneurship major or minor. But the management literature is very confused about what entrepreneurship is. It's sort of a generic catch-all word that includes things like creativity and being thinking outside the box. Sometimes it's used in a very narrow way to apply only to self-employment and new venture formation. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with innovation and venture funding. Sometimes it's used just to mean high growth rather than low growth companies. In some of my writings, I've distinguished these different views a couple of different ways. One way I like to think about it, or find it useful to think about, is entrepreneurship an outcome, a phenomenon that we can observe and count and measure, like the number of IPOs, the number of startup companies, the percent of the population that's self-employed, and so on? Or is entrepreneurship a way of thinking or a way of behaving about many different problems, like being innovative, being alert, being creative, making good decisions? Those are things that can apply to a lot of different phenomena, small companies and big companies, new companies and old companies, self-employed and employed people, and so on. So what I find most useful, Mark, is the definition that comes out of Ludwig von Mises, and also the important American economist Frank Knight. And that's the idea that entrepreneurship is ultimately about making decisions about resources under conditions of uncertainty. Right? So Mises emphasizes that all human action takes place under conditions of uncertainty, meaning we never know exactly whether our actions are going to lead to the outcomes that we desire. So, for example, all of your listeners right now have allocated, maybe they had an out-of-pocket expense for travel or to buy a new webcam or computer time, or maybe it's just the value of their time, the opportunity cost of their time, but they've made an investment in participating in this conference today. And they did it because they thought they would learn something, they would make friends, they would do some networking, make some contacts, get some ideas that would make their business better, maybe just personal enjoyment and satisfaction. But the point is, they didn't know for sure exactly how big those benefits would be. They took a risk, in other words. Yeah. So they invested some resources up front, their time, their expertise, their reputation, maybe some dollars, in anticipation of some reward that would come later. And they had to make kind of a judgment call about whether the reward would be big enough, whether they thought it would be big enough to justify the expenditure. Mises points out that that's what human action is all about, as opposed to kind of, robotic action or instinct, where people do things because, for reasons they can't really put their finger on. Mises says, no, human action is purposeful, it's goal-oriented, and if there's uncertainty, as there is in the real world, we don't know for sure that the means we employ will lead to the ends that we desire. And we all bear a little bit of uncertainty in our everyday decisions about what to do and where to go and so on. So the way Mises describes the behavior of entrepreneurs is they are the agents in society that are responsible for making decisions about how to allocate scarce resources, particularly factors of production, land, machines, capital goods, and so on. They use these resources and control these resources and combine these resources in different ways in anticipation of satisfying consumers' wants in the future, and thus earning some monetary revenue that they hope will cover their costs. So Mises has in mind a very active role, a controlling role, a sort of decisive role. The word that I've used in my own research, a word that's borrowed from Frank